Hello, thank you very much. Okay, so UK evidence on traditional families is stronger than for blended families arising from separation. Okay, so this, when by blended families, I'm talking about families arising from separation. So it could be where two parents are living apart, single parent families, step families, so the whole kind of array. Okay, so basically this was the conclusion from our recent scoping study looking at the data infrastructure on family separation and separating families. And it was a scoping study again funded by the Nuffield Foundation, who really support this kind of work, which is fantastic. And it involved not just me, but a whole team of methodologists and substantive experts, so across a range of disciplines and policy areas. Okay, so my presentation structure today is going to mirror the stages of our study and what we were trying to answer in our study. So firstly, why should we be concerned that there's a disparity between the data collected on traditional or intact families versus separated families? What evidence do we need that we haven't got? Why are the data lacking? And most importantly, at the end, we looked at what we could or can do about it. And I guess this was the key part of what we were looking at, because we already knew that we were going to have, some of the, we could already predicted the first three. And unsurprisingly, given I'm here talking at a closer talk, our conclusion is that we need more longitudinal survey data to plug these gaps. Okay. And what I'm going to talk about today is based on lots and lots of conversations and consultation across government, across policy interest groups, across academics, lots of trawling and reviewing of what's out there, and lots of thinking and head scratching to come up with the conclusions that we did. Okay, so why should we be concerned, firstly, about improving the data that we have on separating and separated families? Okay, so the first reason why we should be bothered about this is because family separation is really common. You can't talk about the norm of a stable two-parent family that stays stable throughout childhood. And I've just given you a smattering of statistics here. There are many, many more which are relevant to my argument. 1 child in 6 is born into a single-parent household, if you look at the Millennium Cohort data. 1 in 3 children experience the separation of their parents during their childhood. So this equates to any point in time, you've got 2.5 million separated families raising 4 million children. Okay, so about 3 million in single-parent households and 1 million living with step-parents. This is because 2% of UK families with dependent-age children separate each year. Okay, so this is not a minority group that we're talking about. We can't ignore them in our data collection. And what's more important, or as important, or adds to the argument, is that family separation can be associated with poorer outcomes. Okay, that's both for parents and for children. And my list of examples are about children, not the parents, behavioural issues, educational attainment, health, well, that would be both, and risky behaviours. Now, unpicking causality about what is caused by the family separating is obviously very difficult to do. Families aren't randomly assigned into living together or separating, but those who have really tried really hard to unpick causality, the evidence is suggesting that family separation can be associated with the resultant living conditions of both parts of the family that separate, so housing conditions and finances. Post-separation parenting approaches, obviously it's quite difficult to start parenting, co-parenting when you're living apart and potentially sometimes have had acrimonious breakups, relationships between parents and between non-resident parents and children, and there's a growing evidence around the added strain of complex family structures, so how people navigate through step families and so on. Okay, so in terms of why we should be concerned, one thing we need to know more about all of this, but we particularly need to know why is it that some families are negatively affected and others aren't. Okay, that's why I keep stressing that it can be associated. Okay, all right, so next. Okay, third reason about why should we be concerned is it's particularly pertinent now. Okay, obviously we've been seeing this gradual change in terms of family structure and family fluidity over the last few decades. But the need for crying out for these data aren't new, but I guess two reasons why it's particularly pertinent now. One is the increasing recognition of the importance of co-parenting. Okay, so it's no longer enough to kind of measure the kind of non-resident parent with all the provisos of the definition of non-resident parent, which I concur with Rebecca. It's no longer enough to say, well, how often do they see them? Do they pay any money? We need to know about family functioning and non-resident parent involvement, and also step-parent roles and the growing issue around shared parenting. Second reason why this was particularly pertinent now, and one of the reasons why Nuffield probably funded our project, is that there are several key policy changes affecting separating and separated families, which means that there's more urgent need for current data. There's a whole range of changes where families are being encouraged to make family-based arrangements rather than going through statutory systems like the Child Support Agency, as it previously called, or the courts. And they've instead been investing in relationship support services. So we need to know what the impact of these things are on families. There are also a whole range of welfare changes which are affecting low-income households and single parents, like universal credit and the benefit cap, all of which need to be monitored. Okay, so what evidence do we need? Okay, short-term and longer-term evidence. This is kind of based on a wide-ranging consultation. As I said, we've talked to lots of people. At its simplest, and I think it's important to remember this kind of simple level, we need to describe and document how families are changing in their structure and in their functioning. As social scientists, this is our job, I think, to monitor and document. But beyond this, we also need to understand the ways in which structures are actually affecting the trajectories and the outcomes of both parents and children. So informing policy and practice, and also, more generally understanding the impact on well-being and future life chances. Okay, what evidence do we need? What came out really, really strongly in our discussions is that parenting in separated families is different to parenting where two parents live full-time in the house together. So the experience of growing up and the experience of parenting in a separated family is different, and we can't just rely on asking the same questions that we ask of traditional intact families to these separated families. So we need data from different family members. Okay, so as Rebecca was saying, most of the data is collected from and about the resident parent. We need the mirrored data from non-resident parents. We need to know from children themselves. And we also need to know from the wider families that develop from these kind of blended families. Okay, so step and half. Okay. In terms of the data we need here, I'm conscious of probably my time, so this is just a list of the kind of data that we think we need, which is different from the traditional. So co-parenting when parents aren't in a relationship, the formation and the dynamics around step families, how children spend their time across and within two households, particularly with the growth of children spending amounts of time with both parents, their relationship, lack of relationship in about a third of cases with non-resident parents. My particular interest, the ways in which what was the incomes that covered one household suddenly having to split across and somehow support two households, and the whole kind of negotiation around that, either with or without the kind of help and support of statutory or legal services. So the point at the bottom is relevant to when we're saying about what data we need, is that lots of these things are pertinent to all separated families, but there is a particular crunch point at the point when families are separating, when lots of these kind of negotiations are happening. So we need particular data around the kind of separating period. Okay, why on earth are the data lacking when I've so clearly argued why we need better data? Good number of reasons for this. It's not an easy answer. The first issue is that the administrative data that we've got that captures separated families is shrinking. So it's becoming of reduced value. And this is partly because of what I was saying before in terms of the policy changes. There are fewer families, and increasingly fewer families, who will be going to the court to sort out arrangements and who will be going to the statutory services. Partly because, for instance, with the child maintenance service, as it's now called, parents are being charged. If they want to use that service, they will need to pay to use it. So, and they're being encouraged instead to make their own arrangements. Okay, so even if you cobble together the people who do go to the court, people who are on welfare benefits, the people who go to statutory services, you've got nothing like a census, even if you put them together. And spent lots of discussions actually in our consultation of people saying, oh, you can just combine all these admin data and then you've got your sample, and you go, no. Those people we have got are biased towards low income, higher conflict families, domestic violence cases, because those are the ones that are going through the statutory services or they're claiming welfare benefits. Limited value for either for substantive analysis or for survey sampling. So we need the evidence of the families who are outside of the system, and they can only be collected by survey data or qualitative research. And in reality, again, coming back to the big discussions I had, about using admin data, the kind of things I was saying that we need to know about separating separated families aren't really in the administrative data anyway, even if you could, they were present in the admin data. Okay, there are government studies, government commissions, evaluations and research, but they're usually one-off cross-sectional snapshots, usually of particular research questions needed in a hurry, and usually focusing on specific groups, usually again the ones that are in touch with the system. So they're useful piecemeal evidence, but we need longitudinal data to understand some of the dynamics and the pathways, the kind of evidence I was talking about, and we need to know about those outside the system. Okay, what we have got are the amazing resources of the household panel and birth cohorts. And particularly with government spending cuts, we mean we've got even greater reliance on these studies. So I've listed just 2, 3 there and a hopeful in terms of the main data sets. So we've got Understanding Society, Millennium Cohort, and now Next Steps coming on, and hopefully a future cohort study, but let's park that one. These studies provide really good holistic data, and they're representative of all the separated families that we're interested in, and it's longitudinal, so we can track outcomes. Sometimes we can track them prior to separation, which is gold dust. But much as we try and persuade the owners of these studies, there's a limit to how much we could add to these studies about family separation. There is loads of people knocking at the door of these studies trying to add questions, so we can never get the kind of depth and granularity that we might want by asking the owners of these studies. And also, even with the massive sample sizes that we're talking about in terms of Understanding Society and the birth cohort studies, if you're particularly interested in this newly separated group that I'm talking about, there's still a very limited number. So something like Understanding Society started with about 40,000 households. By the time you take into account those with dependent children, and then the 2% of those who separate each year, you've got about 100 of them per wave. So it takes quite a long time to aggregate up enough numbers of those who are newly separated. And as we've been discussing earlier, most of the data comes from resident parents. UKHLS does try really, really hard to identify and track non-resident parents, but for a number of reasons we can come back to, those who do self-identify are skewed towards those who tend to be more involved with their children, and it's really hard to retain those in studies after people separate. I'm actually doing some experimental work with Understanding Society on this that we could talk about to try and improve that problem. MCS focuses on the resident family, as many birth cohort studies have done in the past. Life Study was going to attempt to include non-resident parents from the start, but obviously that isn't happening as a study. And the MCS, obviously they're in their late teens now, so in terms of actually sort of looking at current cohorts of younger children, we might be looking at the children of the Next Steps cohort. Great data on the households in which the children are living, okay, but it's largely mirrors what's collected from traditional families. So there's not very much specific asked about how families navigate through co-parenting in separated households. What can we do about it? It's not easy, okay, I'm not, even though I've identified all these things. We need longitudinal survey data, but If you're thinking about a survey of separating and separated families, we haven't got a sampling frame. So this requires a huge amount of large-scale filtering of households, which is, obviously you can imagine, expensive and prone to bias. And if you're looking about those who have recently separated, then you're looking at a very, very small proportion of people. Okay. Recruitment and retention of separated families is very hard. Non-resident parents don't self-identify. In understanding society, where they're asked, the way they ask them to self-identify, you end up with about a third of the number of non-resident parents you would expect to get, a third of the number of parents for care who also put their hands up and identified themselves. And they are far more skewed towards those who are in contact and those who pay maintenance. So they don't self-identify in the first place, and if they separate during the course of the study, they are much more likely to drop out. I mean, the numbers are in the per wave in Understanding Society, where you've got the non-resident parent after a separation, are in the kind of, I think it's about 30 per wave. And the other reason why it's methodologically challenging is saying if we can solve all of these things, because there's a lot of new question development, all these things I think we're saying we need data on, the questions all need developing and testing over time. Okay. Can't conclude that it's all too hard though, because I've already argued why we need the data. So we came up in our study, and I'll just quickly tell you what our kind of conclusions were. We've got the full link to the full report at the end. We basically looked at different approaches to addressing these evidence gaps, and we tried to balance between cost and feasibility and depth of data. So our first option was a new longitudinal study of families. Okay, so and this is if we had an unrestricted budget. This is why I've said could do. If we had unrestricted budget, this is what we would do. We would set up the equivalent of Understanding Society, or maybe a birth cohort study that had different ages starting, so we've got a kind of sort of stepped cross section. We would set up a study of families and we track them over time. 2% of them are going to separate each wave. Great. We can gradually build up a sample of separated families. The advantage of this is that we've got pre-separation data and post-separation data. You can identify those newly separated families quickly, get in there, ask them a whole series of questions. We've got resident and non-resident parents from the same household, which is really important. Well, in the same household, and then they split and they're in their two households from the same family. And you can sell the survey about one that's all about families, which hopefully would improve the retention. So even that people think, okay, even if I've split up from this, we're going on, that there's still, we've been tracking this family, and there'll be some kind of traction in terms of keeping both parents in the study. And you can devote all your interview time to relevant issues. Okay. Now, to warrant this, we're talking about having something like a sample size of 28,000 families with children, okay, to get about 300 to 400 separations per wave, okay. Our estimate, which somebody has told us is a huge underestimate at the time, was £4 million per wave, okay. So in order to go down a route like this, you'd have to have a big call for data about family life more generally, okay, which was outside of the scope of our study, but is something for discussion. Second option we had was a new longitudinal study of separating and separated families. Okay, so we lose the idea about the pre-separation data. Potentially more realistic financially, about £1 million per wave. So this is the idea. You start with a sample cross-section of separated families, track them over time with a boost of newly separated. The advantages are the same as before in terms of selling, how you sell the study, and you could devote all the interview time to pertinent issues. Disadvantages is even more methodologically challenging than the first one, because you've got to find the separated families. So you've got to find the separated families, and the newly separated families, even more difficult. You don't have the pre-separation data. And really importantly, I've said very hard, and I think the answer is impossible, the idea that through this route you would then be able to recruit both the resident and the non-resident parent in an already separated household. I think that would be really hard. So what you'd end up with two separate studies of resident and non-resident families in that way. And you've still got to crack the problem of the self-identification of non-resident parents. Final option, which is just to say, okay, these two aren't going to happen in a hurry. Hopefully they might happen over time, especially if we talk about it in audiences like this. The other thing is to try and actually add what we can to the existing studies. And most of what the discussions we've had so far have been actually about understanding society because they provide the cross-section of all separated families. So adding a limited number of new questions, limited being the operative word, I think, really, given what we're saying about interview time and constraints. But, you know, interestingly, the idea would be, one idea is to actually have follow-up studies where certain trigger points, like a separation or a step-parent coming into the household, that you'd have a trigger, an additional survey that would happen where you go out and actually follow up and talk to those people in more detail. Capitalising on existing studies, clearly very attractive for a whole range of reasons. These are huge studies to set up, they're very expensive. Wouldn't solve our sample size problems, wouldn't solve the non-representativeness of the non-resident parents, and the other thing is you need to weigh up the risks to the overall panel. Obviously, this will be a big ask for any existing study, and they would have to really think about that. Okay, so our ideal next steps is we're carrying on discussions with UKHLS, cohort studies, but I think parallel to that, what we really wanted to do was actually try and get some funding for a large-scale two-wave pilot, or a modest, so a large-scale two-wave pilot where we can actually, this is the idea if you have a survey of separating and separated families, so you use it as a methodological testing ground, which will be useful even if you're ending up, trying to feed into how you do things on the UKHLS or a birth cohort study. So you use it as a methodological testing ground, but you also, at the same time, are collecting some short to medium term information, which is crucial for all the reasons I was saying earlier in terms of the fact that we are at a crossroads where we really need to understand what's happening to these families. And that's just the link to the full report and my contact details. Thank you.